everybody. I am talking about payment channels today in the context of blockchain economics. The slides are available online at slideshare.net/lablaga. I'm a technology theorist in the philosophy department at Purdue University. I have a Wall Street background and MBA in finance and accounting, and I'm currently theorizing technologies such as blockchain. I wrote a book called Blockchain. It's the O'Reilly book, suggesting a vision for how we might build this world together. I'd like us to put on our mindset of innovation and consider the killer apps of blockchain. Somebody is going to create the Netscape and Google of blockchain that really makes this technology mainstream and useful. Payment channels concern different kinds of ways that we use economics and finance, which are basically just systems for organizing access to resources. It's important to consider the radical implication of distributed networks, which, unlike centralized networks or decentralized networks, which are based on hubs and spokes, in distributed networks, the implication is that every node is a peer that can provide services to other peers. That's how the current Bitcoin blockchain operates right now, in that nodes deliver services to others, possibly for a small fee. Transaction ledger hosting is conducted by about 10 or currently 11,000 Bitcoin D nodes running the full ledger worldwide. The mining operation confirms and logs transactions, and that's conducted by other peer participants. There are starting to be new services, a decentralized version of Reddit, conceptually, called Steemit and Yours. And the implication is that with new technologies like payment channels, that each peer might be able to provide banking services. Essentially, every cell phone becomes a bank. So the concept of payment channels is that there are two important concepts to understand in regard to payment channels. First is from computer science of networks. A network is a graph. It's composed of vertices and edges, nodes and the relations between these nodes. The earliest problem identified by this of a network is Euler, identifying the 7 bridges of Königsberg in the 1800s and how they're connected, how there is relationality and an optimization in terms of routing across the network of nodes for entailing to get to any particular location. So the first thing we want to consider is that now with blockchain technology, finance is running on networks, and we don't really know what that is yet. The second key concept behind payment channels is that of net clearing. So instead of clearing transactions on a gross transfers basis, they could clear on a net basis. So what this means is that we could have essentially a contracts for difference economy. A contract for difference or spread bet is concept and instrument known in finance. In finance, so you could bet on how much IBM is going to go up, not buy the whole underlying. And so this is a leverage, and when it's used in finance, contracts for difference are typically leveraged just like options at 10 times the amount. But when I think of the contracts for difference concept in terms of economic terms, I'm just meaning it as a synonym for net clearing or spread betting, a net settlement. The key idea is that settlement could be on a net basis rather than a gross basis, and that would imply that lots less money is shifting hands, which means that we could rethink how we do debt and many other kinds of operations in society. And so then relatedly, the idea with payment channels is that you might run an account, run a tab or have an account with any kind of party, individuals, corporations, institutions, in this new kind of payment channel economy. More specifically, a payment channel is a 3-step financial contract executed over time. First, one party opens a payment channel with another party and posts a prepayment escrow balance on file. The party then consumes against this credit over the given time period. Consumed activity is tracked but not booked to the main ledger. Then number 3, at the end of the period, cumulative activity is booked in one net transaction to close the contract. The motivation for payment channels is to improve scalability through having contractually obligated relationships booked as periodic net activity. So you run a tab with all kinds of different vendors, and then periodically activity is closed out and actually recognized. The incentive for payment channels came from micropayments, say for watching YouTube videos, where it doesn't make sense to have piecemeal transactions for every minute of time consumed. Although different kinds of payment channel applications in browsers do track consumption, say on a per second basis, and settle it out. And that is one of the first examples of payment contracts, but the idea is that they might apply much more widely in the economy. The bigger implication of payment channels is that they might develop into a digitized payment system for resource consumption that settles based on net payments instead of gross transfers and enables peer-to-peer banking services. This kind of, there's a much more sophisticated functionality available already in the Bitcoin blockchain than I'm going to get into because this is not a technical talk. Basically, you can do payment channels right now in the Bitcoin blockchain because there are opcodes such as check lock time verify and check sequence verify. And you would need to do a lot of programming, but the functionality to do future locked payments and tracking mechanisms, essentially a payment channel, already exists currently in the Bitcoin blockchain. And it's just that the Lightning Network is a platform dedicated to this that runs on the new version of Bitcoin, the software update with SegWit 2x that's being implemented in November 2017. And so that means that really any new wallet may become payment channel enabled, and it may be quite easy, in fact, to just enter a payment contract directly on your phone as opposed to having to script it yourself right now. So I'm going to discuss 5 levels of payment channel applications. The first and most straightforward is the Starbucks example. So in this case, a customer might open up a $50 monthly payment channel with Starbucks. Daily coffees are consumed and tracked against this $50 credit. And then at the end of the period, activity is netted at the end of the month, say, and the contract is closed and rolled over. If it's going to be a regular ongoing contract, they might have a regular rollover period. Either party may close the payment channel at any time and do the gross or the cumulative settlement at any moment. I submit that, in fact, Starbucks is already running a prototype version of a payment channel through their loyalty program because 41% of Starbucks purchases are via the loyalty cards or apps program that they have, which for them means a $1.2 billion obligation on their balance sheet. So they, on the one side, have $1.2 billion of cash easily earned from their loyalty program, and that's booked on the offsetting entry is booked as a stored value card obligation on the liability side of the balance sheet for $1.2 billion. So already in the most simple, straightforward case of a payment channel, we might start to wonder about accounting and legal treatment. The great promise of cryptocurrencies is that they're programmable money, and we start to see that in implementation in payment channels. The degree of discretion and autonomy with which contracts and relationships might be specified. This new kind of thing, a contingent 3-part financial contract over time, is a new beast, a new kind of financial instrument. We see that it has elements, recognizable features of other financial contracts, such as prepayment risk. Either party can close the contract at any time, and that is a big feature of the mortgage industry, for example. Likewise, there is option functionality in payment contracts, the European or American style option execution, and also possibly the idea of leverage. So fractional reserves. Right now, the payment channel concept is you put up your full credit balance, your escrow on file, and that can be only committed on a one-to-one direct basis to finance, as a credit to finance activity. But what if there could be fractional reserves, and what does that imply? Is that is that too much risk, or is that actually a benefit? Because I can only have as much as my current cash balance is locked up in a payment channel. In other words, if I have $50 booked with Starbucks, I can't use that same $50 to also be booked with Netflix. So from an accounting perspective, are payment channels deferred payment contracts, installment sales? When is it appropriate to recognize revenue and liability? From a legal perspective, are payment contracts assignments of claims or forward-looking IOUs? So all of this would need to be settled. Payment channels level 2. These are small group concatenated payments. So this example has been discussed by Andreas Antonopoulos, and this is a case of we have your local bar, we have Lynn and Chris and a bartender. Lynn is running a $10 tab with a bartender and has consumed $6. Chris also has a $10 tab with a bartender and has consumed $5 towards this. Lynn and Chris play pool, and Chris ends up owing Lynn $5. So I've listed the ledgers of how the balances of who owes whom what work out. And in the current method, which is gross settlement, each party would settle with each other on a one-to-one basis. That would involve 3 transactions and $16 of gross monetary flow. But in the new method, the net settlement method via your app on your phone, so you wouldn't have to think about it and do the math after you've had some beers, there would be 2 transactions and $11 of gross flows transferred. So already the implication is that less money would transfer in a payment channel economy, and that means more is available for other kinds of things. Payment channels level 3. This is the example of my monthly expenses. So I argue that we're already running de facto payment channels in a lot of ways, even in the way we conduct our own individual operations right now. And what if a payment channel could just bypass me as an intermediary party and settle my monthly inflows and outflows for me with just the net credit or debit out to whatever entity at the end? You don't actually really need me in the middle, but it does happen to be my Chase bank account that clears everything right now. So this is in the sense that many people are in fact obligated to have direct deposit of their paychecks. So that comes into your checking account. And then your outflows in many cases are also auto pays. So these are for both fixed and variable costs, say your mortgage payment, your car payment, your utility bills. A lot of these are auto pay. And then at the end, there could be whatever net amount might go out to an investment account at Schwab or whatever. So already I argue that my monthly expenses for people that are interested in this could be organized and formalized into a net payment channel format, such that this would streamline the economy, and it implies that the net settlement basis causes less capital to transfer and therefore leaves more available for other kinds of things like debt repayment. So not only my personal monthly expenses might be considered in a payment channel format, but also business entities. So I think about my monthly expenses, then I think about my apartment building's monthly expenses. So again, they have, in a payment channel, the net inflows could be booked, the net outflows could be booked in terms of fixed and variable expenses, and then the net profit or loss also booked per contractual details. My apartment building, as well as my small business, is in the same. All businesses are organized, and all entities, in fact, are organized around this same kind of structure of inflows and outflows with some sort of net. And so this could all be organized in the future in a payment channel structure. So moving up a step would be my supply chain, the payment graph economy. So this is some of the more radical kinds of ideas of what might need to happen. So we're curious about how to actually roll payment channels and the blockchain economy into industrial supply chains, goods and services. And so I think what needs to happen for that is that we need to have integrated ledgers. So instead of one set of general ledger accounting books for each entity, each business, we actually have an integrated ledger system across the supply chain. So Walmart, for example, books the revenue, but the COGS and inventory accounts belong to their vendors, John Deere tractors and Adidas shoes, for example. And then that extends the work in progress and the materials accounts roll downstream to the supply chain vendors that are responsible for the next level of activity further down in the supply chain. And so the great benefit of blockchains is, if we think about the property of Merkle routing, or synecdoche is another way to say it, that any small piece calls the whole large piece, this property allows us to have arbitrarily many levels of detail roll up and roll down. And so we would still, of course, have accounting books at the level of entity, as we do now for individuals and entities, businesses, government, institutions, etc. So one view of the accounting ledger would be by entity, and that's how we obligate taxes and responsibility, licensing, and so forth. But there could be, because of the synecdoche or Merkle routing property of blockchains, we could also have a view of ledgers across whole business lines, across the whole supply chain. So here the concept is, right now, the blockchain is only dealing with one account on the whole general ledger so far, and that's the cash account. So we have essentially the Bitcoin blockchain is a giant subledger-based cash account ledger. Bob has this much cash in terms of unspent transaction outputs on the Bitcoin blockchain. Alice has this amount, but it's all just a cash and one big cash ledger. So we didn't even start to consider all of the full range of accounting accounts on the general ledger, which include the balance sheet, the income statement, and the cash flow. And so once we get all of these accounts operating in interoperable shared ledgers across supply chains, that will allow us to do net clearing on a much larger basis, on a cross-entity basis, as opposed to an individual entity basis. And that's what we are really going to need to attack the debt problem. And so related to this is that 2/3 of the economy is tied up in supply chain finance, and that's because the incentive is to play the float. They're completely different trajectories in terms of the goods production, timing, and trajectory, and the incentives for what operates in the actual production of goods, production, distribution, and consumption of goods, from the payments trajectory for that. And that's a completely separate beast that has different kinds of incentives, the biggest one of which is to play the float. So when I'm a large vendor, my incentive is to delay my payments to vendors as long as possible, because I'm going to theoretically, in the former world, make more interest on the float. But still, the incentive is to hold cash on hand the maximum amount of time possible. And so if the incentives with shared ledgers, then the incentive structures in business might change to be much more of one of a just-in-time economy, not only for goods but for money. So we've gone to a just-in-time economy for over the last 20 years for goods, just-in-time delivery of physical material goods, but we haven't come to a just-in-time market for money in the industrial supply chain. And so I'm arguing that integrated ledgers is something that would allow us to do this. And that would certainly be by some big experiment of public and private ledgers, initially quite private ledgers. So just like there is in the current supply chain world, EDIs and VPNs, where there is some amount of corporate data sharing, that could be facilitated and extended through private blockchains. And then it would also allow what I'm starting to talk about, which is an integrated ledger view, shared ledgers within the same business line. And that is what is going to allow us. So if we're looking at the whole supply chain as an entity as opposed to businesses as entities, then we can get net flows rolling across the supply chain. Level 4 payment channels, the Kevin Bacon example. So one of the initial proposals with payment channels was, look, I want to pay for my Airbnb in Europe, but I don't know anybody in Spain. So how can I do a Bitcoin transaction with them? And so part of the idea was, well, the Kevin Bacon problem, well, certainly I don't know that person in Spain, but a few hops in the network. and we can probably get a path going over to that other person. But the idea with these payment graphs, credit graphs, is that you don't actually have to find people. You just hop on the network, and the payment graph routes you. In fact, you don't need to. There is a pathway, a Kevin Bacon pathway to the person you're trying to reach. But B, you don't even have to know it. The network sorts it out for you amongst participating nodes in the network. As I mentioned, essentially every cell phone is a bank or is a banking network hop, and can route your transaction along. So the result is that we have essentially a very large network payment graph for money. So just like the internet, we transfer information, we transfer money on credit graphs. And one benefit is that, unlike the internet, you need to reassemble the packets in the correct order once they get to their destination. But that's not so with money. We don't really care. All the packets, all the iota, all the quanta of money need to get there in one big chunk and be assembled in one chunk, but the order doesn't matter. So on the one hand, it's much more complicated than internet packet routing because of the double spend problem. We only want unique packets sent, and there's vastly more security involved with money, the digital signatures to confirm that it is just only this particular quanta or packet of money arriving currently. But on the other hand, it's perhaps it could be easier than some of the internet traffic transfer protocols currently in other ways, in the ways that the packets don't have to be assembled in a particular order at the other end. So some of the different ideas for how concepts like the Lightning Network might unfold in practice are either that every node is peer banker. So my wallet is permission to clear transactions and make small transaction fees on that. So for example, right now during this talk, my wallet is clearing coffee for a couple of people in the lobby that are buying coffee, and I make a couple of cents for that. So my peer app provides a banking service of a confirmation of parties having the ability to transfer those funds. And then the other idea is that perhaps not every node is a peer banker, but that there are hubs or payment gateways. And that might be how things start to roll out initially until we really work through this concept. It's a live sandboxing all the time with things like the Bitcoin blockchain. Even though, apps are running a lot on the testnet, but since it's money, we want to proceed slowly and really make sure we're understanding everything that's happening, and also the risks of any kind of malfeasance that might be incentivized on the networks. Payment channels level 5, the Mike Hearn example. So Mike Hearn, I call this the Mike Hearn example because he suggested the idea that at some moment blockchain networks would be smart enough to auto-sense demand and auto-instantiate entities to respond to that demand. So we might have in the farther future the possibility of auto-instantiating self-driving cars that sense a need because there's a trade show in at airport XYZ, so we have a 5 to 20% influx of transportation demand that we don't have. So we need a just-in-time resource to respond to that. And the network would sense this demand and respond to it. And so the same idea could be applied to the concept of banking and financial services. So just like the smart network senses demand for transportation picking up, the smart network might instantiate banking services directly, sensing the demand for certain kinds of credit and banking services, auto-instantiating responses to that, providing services, and retiring when necessary. Also pricing those services could be something that deep learning networks or other kinds of sophisticated computing technologies contribute to. So deep learning networks could be used for two different kinds of applications, and those are basically for estimating the fees and pricing, and then also for fraud detection. So the patterns, trying to pick up the money laundering activity in cryptographic networks, because there's a much different traffic signature pattern than bona fide traffic. And then the possibility of having auto-instantiating banking services on payment graphs suggests or makes us notice that, in fact, the network node does not actually need to be human-backed. So from a technical perspective, people don't need to be involved. We're already depending on cryptographic software as the trustless intermediary that switches our transactions, that we don't need to trust third-party institutions with our transactions anymore. And so while we have, historically, we vest the responsibility and the role of different kinds of legal aspects in personhood, but that is not necessarily, that doesn't need to be the case from a technical perspective on payment graphs. So there could be a question, well, is a graph, a network, the next form of legal personhood, and how autonomous and what rights and responsibilities, for example, do transnational superorganism networks have? So these are all questions for the future. Implications of payment channels. With money and payment channels digitized and activity becoming securely forward committed by payment contracts, the implication is that net flows instead of gross flows might be transferred. An economy based on net clearings rather than gross transfers could mean more activity and less debt. Finally, we can rethink a marquee problem of our era, debt, with the idea of streaming money, proposed by Andreas Antonopoulos and others, that could be disgorged in much smaller chunks that are more closely tied to costs and repayment possibilities. The challenge is how to construct net rather than gross obligations for home mortgages, student loans, public works projects, and bond offerings. So if I start to think about different larger scale operations in my immediate environment, for example, at my university, how could we start to move certain pieces of economic activity into a net contract basis as opposed to a gross flow? And that does absolutely imply much greater integration and trust between parties, and probably a change in incentives. So there could be substantial resistance. And I think overall that what net clearing means that we have more flavors. Just like now we have chocolate, vanilla, and strawberry. We have centralized, decentralized, and distributed networks. Sometimes one is better for a particular operation, and for complicated operations, hybrid networks are best. So similarly with payment channels, so we just start to have more flavors. So instead of having to transfer everything on a gross basis, we now can start to transfer certain discrete applications on a net basis. And so it's up to us to start to try to figure this out. So for example, I wouldn't want my whole personal finances to be locked up in net settling payment contracts, but for the sake of ease and freeing up my available credit for debt for new business projects, then I'm happy to obligate my known monthly expenses, for example, into a payment contract structure, because that will allow me to borrow more on my credit line to set up my new deep qualia business and give me access to capital. I can get access to capital by reorganizing how I do my own personal finances. And this will be a tremendous benefit to entrepreneurs. So conceptually, we can rethink the different kinds of modes of consumption that we have. Prepay credit versus post-pay. So only a small portion of overall economic activity is currently conducted in prepaid consumption. And that's where payment channels are playing so far in the concept, which would be put up a prepayment escrow and book consumption against that and net it out at the end. But we can't we can't do the whole economy on a prepaid escrow basis. We can do it on a terms and run a tab basis, which is how the supply chain works currently. So I mentioned that 2/3 of the economy is tied up in supply chain finance because incentives are to play the float. But digitized streaming money and payment channels might be techniques to quicken the 30, 60, 90-day terms and uncollectible debt problem in supply chain finance and facilitate a just-in-time economy for money. We think because Lightning is We're hoping Lightning is coming with many interesting payment channel possibilities in November with the upgrade to SegWit 2, the hard fork on the Bitcoin blockchain. But payment graphs have already been existing in finance for some time. The Ripple credit network has been operating for 5 years already, and there are some interesting studies published by some researchers at Purdue University in the computer science department that have looked at this. So one interesting thing about the Ripple network is that the first thing we might want to notice is that transactions are highly interoperable. It's not just cryptocurrency exchanges at all. There is cross-border fiat remittance, there is cryptocurrency exchange, there is user-defined currencies as an available functionality, and in their recently introduced ILP, integrated ledger payment, that it doesn't matter. It's just like email. It doesn't matter what network or what app somebody else is using. Maybe I'm transferring money. I want to transfer money to somebody in China using Alipay, or somebody in Zimbabwe using Bitcoin, or with fiat currency or PayPal. So the payment method starts to become transparent. It doesn't matter anymore who's using what. We can all interoperate. So it's interoperability for payment methods. Second main point about Ripple is the extensive wallet functionality. So not just is it access to cash, but it's access to credit and the ability to issue credit. Every wallet can access cash, access credit, and issue credit. So the research has looked at the period from the beginning of 2013 to the end of 2016 and reviewed the Ripple credit network, where there are almost 100,000 wallets, 99,413 wallets, 246,000 credit links, and 27.4 million transactions have taken place on the Ripple credit network. 12 of the world's 50 top banks belong to the network, and it's quite interesting. It's an open network in that any party can join, and it's comprised of large payment gateways and money market makers. So any individual is encouraged to be a market maker and provide these exchange services between the different currencies and transactions on the network. The consensus mechanism is via validators, of which there are 55 currently that confirm the transactions, and new transaction blocks settle every 4 seconds. So that's quite a bit faster than the 7 to 8 minutes of the Bitcoin blockchain currently. Here's an example of the Ripple credit network, which is a weighted directed payment graph of IOU credit links. And the credit graph, essentially, that they're comprised of vertices and edges, like any graph, where the vertices or the nodes are the wallets and track the wallet balances, and the edges have the credit links, the amount of credit links one or both ways between nodes on the network. So this is part of the conceptual point that cryptocurrencies means that finance is running on networks, and that's really a different kind of thing that we're only just starting to understand what that is and entails from every kind of perspective. However, I argue that payment graphs are not such a new thing, but they're merely the next step in the automatic market's progression. We're used to algorithmic trading in high-frequency trading, hedge funds, for example. We're used to already the real-time bidding market for advertising, the highly digitized market for global energy trading that's automated for the production, storage, and transmission of energy across large geographical networks, and distributed energy management systems. So the next steps, this involves banking and finance, which is, since it's related to money, is automatically more sensitive, but there is a precedent for moving our world towards these automated markets examples. And in banking and finance, we have already Ripple that's been in operation for 5 years with 27 million transactions. Dfinity, which has a prototype app out there doing automated commercial loan approval. And the other example of Facebook payments, which is a social graph, which becomes a payment graph, which is an interesting merging of two different kinds of networks. And then so Lightning, the Lightning Network and these payment channel possibilities on blockchains are just part of this same transition to payment graphs, the market as a graph, and automated markets more generally. In conclusion, I think the biggest question is how can we use these concepts and tools to solve another class of economic problems? There's a lot of problems right now are that the economic incentives are completely at odds with the outcome that we're wanting to produce. So debt is the number one kind of area for this. Another area is supply chain, where the incentive is to play the float, to not pay as long as possible. Healthcare is another domain where there's a maximization of service consumption incentive as opposed to a price rationalization incentive. Entitlements, could we have Social Security payment channels, for example? What about income equality and the digital divide, the automation economy and technological unemployment? These are the kinds of future class economic problems that are facing us right now, and so my biggest curiosity is how can we use payment concepts like blockchains, payment channels, distributed ledgers, credit graphs, etc., to solve this bigger class of economic problem. And so, for example, one particular area is even just that of having to own stocks. So right now you have to own your own investment assets, but we could possibly have securities as a service, which just like the Uber economy, where we don't have to own the underlying asset anymore to have access to the consumable benefits. And we've moved this way with streaming music services, TV and media consumption, Uber and Airbnb. And so the next class of assets to be able to do that, to move to an Uber economy with, would be securities as a nice demonstration proof. A couple of resources to mention. There are some recent publications in October 2017 on both blockchain philosophy and blockchain economics that I've been involved with that I encourage you to check out. These are intended as conceptual resources to help us build this unfolding world. I also have a book, CFP, open at the moment with collaborators at Blockchain Economics Institutes worldwide. We're looking for 4,000-word chapters due by March 1st, 2018 to me. And the CFP is right on the blockchainstudies.org website. Finally, here are some distributed ledger technology standards bodies on the accounting and internet computing side that are the place to start to get involved, because the quicker we have standards for implementing blockchain technologies into the large and vast way that we do a variety of operations across the economy means the faster the uptake of the benefits of these technologies. Thank you.